My name is Stacey Van Vleet. I am an assistant professor in the history department here at Berkeley, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Dominique Townsend, assistant professor of Buddhist studies at Bard College in New York. And also, I just want to, also thank the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion for inviting Dominique and inviting me to take part in this, and for sponsoring this talk. Dominique Townsend graduated with a master's from the Harvard Divinity School and earned her PhD at Columbia University, where she and I knew each other and have known each other now for some time. Studied together under Gray Tuttle. And as I remember, engaged together in translating the rather florid prose of Desi Sangye Gyatso, and perhaps a more delightfully a short story by Patrul Rinpoche, the drama in the Lotus Garden, or the story of the bees. So, I'm especially happy to be back with Dominique and having this conversation. Her other publications include an article in Himalaya, the Journal for the Association of Nepal and Himalayan Studies, called Buddhism's Worldly Other, Secular Subjects in Tibetan Buddhist Learning, and an article in the Religions Journal, How to Constitute a Field of Merit, Structure and Flexibility in a Tibetan Buddhist Monastery's Curriculum. Dominique Townsend is also a published poet and a children's book author. She has published The Weather and Our Tempers, book of poetry with Brooklyn Arts Press, and Shanti Deva, How to Wake Up a Hero with Wisdom Publications, which I'm looking forward to reading to my own daughter very soon. To introduce Dominique's book, that is the subject of our conversation today, A Buddhist Sensibility, Aesthetic Education at Tibet's Mindröling Monastery. This was published by Columbia University Press in 2021. Also, should put this on my shelf behind me so it can be seen. The book is a highly original and pioneering contribution within Tibetan studies to cultural history, social history, and material history in particular, and certainly also to wider audiences of Buddhist studies, of historians, and those who are interested in the comparative studies of religion. The book takes place in the latter 17th and early 18th centuries, which were a time of rich and extensive cultural production in the Tibetan Buddhist world. Profusion of ornate literary works and luxurious material objects were produced during this time. And Lhasa, the capital of Lhasa, was considered the center of this cultural production, but was by no means the only site of this production. It was embedded within a network that included monasteries, also princely courts, and the households of aristocratic families throughout the Tibetan region, what is often referred to as Central Tibet, also Eastern Tibetan regions of Kham and Amdo, but also across Inner Asia, Mongolian regions, and eventually and increasingly the Manchu sphere and the Qing sphere, and particularly the Qing imperial court at Beijing. So the time that this book recounts is, I would say, close to the beginning, or perhaps the beginning of the middle of this period of great cultural production. And Mindreling holds a very significant place in the sort of longer arc of this golden age for Tibetan culture. Scholars have focused much on the political history of this period and the role of Buddhism in legitimizing governance, particularly through the idea that an ideal system of governance in Tibet, but across the wider region, should integrate the two systems, the lupni of the Buddhist and the worldly spheres, or as Townsend also puts it, of Buddhist and worldly expertise. But this scholarship has, to a large extent, focused on, perhaps the idea of Buddhist dominion over the worldly sphere, with relatively little attention to exactly how Buddhists thought about worldly matters and approached worldly concerns, and the implications for material culture, for education, for what we might call the infrastructure and technologies of governance. And Townsend's work approaches these topics through questions of aesthetics in particular, focusing, as she writes, on the objects of the senses and sensory perception that are so central to Buddhist philosophy, ritual, and experience. She tells us the story of Mindröling, one of the most significant monasteries of central Tibet from its founding in the late 17th century, 1676, and known across this Tibetan Buddhist world for its influence among many aesthetic spheres or types of artistic media. Mindröling was renowned for its literary arts, music, dance, the making of mandalas, monastic fashion or sartorial styles, and also incense making, among other fields of worldly expertise. And it should be said here as well, and Dominique certainly makes the point in her book, that Mindreling was also renowned for its Buddhist teachings and its Buddhist expertise and ritual systems. And in fact, much of the influence of the monastery was spread through large-scale public rituals that attracted hundreds of lamas from the various regions of Tibet that came in attendance. And the literary, one of the insights, central insights of the book is how the literary and artistic production, the focus on creating beautiful forms, material forms and forms of performance and writing, supported the reputation of Mindreling for excellence in the ritual arts and supported the role of this monastery in creating community at this time. And this was particularly significant against the background of the period, which is a background of civil strife and regional conflict. And Townsend focuses on the first 50 years of Mindreling's existence as a monastery. As we said, it was founded in the late 17th century and was actually destroyed for time in 1717 by the invasion of the Dzungar Mongols. It was then rebuilt shortly afterwards, but certainly it was at the heart of these civil conflicts and regional conflicts that brought in both Tibetans and Mongols from the region. And most proximately, the founding of Mindreling had been preceded by the conquering of the entire Tibetan plateau by the Kushite Mongol prince Gushri Khan in 1642. So about 30 years before the founding of this monastery. Gushri Khan is known to have raised the Fifth Dalai Lama, also later known as the Great Fifth Dalai Lama, have raised him to a position of supreme authority in the new Tibetan government, also known as the Ganden Podrang government, where the Fifth Dalai Lama became responsible for creating new systems and new institutions of governance on behalf of this Mongol Tibetan Khanate. And although the Fifth Dalai Lama was a representative of the Gelugpa school, he became remembered as making great efforts to be inclusive of many traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, and in particular relied on partnerships with the Nyingma school, or the ancient school of Tibetan Buddhism, to which the Fifth Dalai Lama had his own family connections. And it's this Nyingma school that Mindreling is a particular exemplar of. And in many ways, the establishment of Mindreling became a joint project between the Fifth Dalai Lama and his Ganden Pochang government, his Gelugpa-led Ganden Pochang government, and an aristocratic family of that was associated with the Nyingma school and had long-standing influence in Tibet, the Nyo clan. So the rituals, the art, and the literature of Mindreling served to help substantiate and enact the project of unification that the Fifth Dalai Lama was envisioning for, and peace that he hoped to enact throughout this chaotic region, which was nevertheless, as we know, a selective process of bringing in certain versions and ideas of what the new rituals promoted by the state and the aesthetics of the state should represent at this time. Again, Townsend, one of her great contributions to understanding this process is in looking at the role of Mindreling in creating what she calls a culture of cosmopolitanism that the Fifth Dalai Lama was also invested in, and which is also somewhat encapsulated by a Tibetan term, rime, later known in the 19th century as a movement or an instance of non-sectarian, a sort of project of non-sectarianism. But in this early period and through the writings and that Dominique looks at, really, she speaks of this rime, this inclusivity of Buddhism, of a Buddhist project, as a wider philosophical and aesthetic project. Interestingly, significantly, bringing in lay people as well as monastics to the monastery of Mindröling to study there, and also bringing in different classes of people, bringing in women in addition to men as important figures in the teaching and education at Mindröling. And to do this, Dominique looks at a wide variety of sources, biographies, letters, instructions for Buddhist practice, monastic histories and curricula, and catalogs of materials that were offered to Buddhist masters and monasteries in the interest, or partially in the interest, of creating merit. So I would, to sort of begin our conversation, wanted to ask Dominique about how you came to this project. And maybe you could, I've given this brief introduction, but maybe you could also set the stage for some of the main characters of your narrative, the monastery itself, Mindreling, and its social world.
Thank you so much, Stacey. That was such a robust introduction. I really appreciate it. And also thank you to the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion for inviting me. And especially thank you to all of the participants. I feel as if we all share a kind of fatigue with Zoom and with certain aspects of our virtual lives. So I'm really grateful that you would log on today and join me for this discussion, join us for this discussion. And as Stacey said, we were graduate students together at Columbia. So this is also feels very, feels like a lucky opportunity to get back together and discuss work this way. So I'm thrilled to be here. I'm going to share my screen to show some images and just begin to kind of flesh out some of what Stacey has already really eloquently begun to discuss. So here we have, I'm sorry, the PowerPoint got a little compressed, so some of these beautiful images are going to be slightly distorted. My apologies for that. But so here we have an image of Mindreling Monastery located in South Central Tibet. This is a photo taken in 2007. And this just gives you a sense of the architecture and the space in which the original monastery was located. I think I first visited Mindreling myself when I was an undergraduate studying abroad with the School for International Training, and was really taken with the place, was very taken with the wall paintings, and with the stories that I began to sort of piece together about the history of this place. So in certain ways, my research on this particular site, but also kind of cultural phenomenon of Mindreling, began when I was actually an undergraduate. So excuse me. Okay, so the kind of star character of the book and of the history of Mindreling is Tardak Lingpa, who is a very famous and beloved figure of the Nyingma school, a renowned treasure revealer, tertön, or visionary. I use Janet Gatso's language for in English, talking about these figures of treasure revealers. So both a very, very important kind of charismatic center for the early history of Mindreling, but also really crucially an institution builder, a really, I think, quite pragmatic and careful, his vision was not only the kind of vision that allowed him to access Buddhist teachings and ritual cycles and truths, but also I think was quite impressive in its attention to practical matters as well in institution building. So he is certainly in the traditional Mindreling sources, he's at the very center of Mindreling. His voice is still sort of resonant throughout its ritual and historical traditions. But as I spent more time with the materials that I used in my research, I realized that there were, really importantly, other figures, the figures that the tradition centers, but in slightly different ways. And a few of those we can see here in the bottom register of this incredibly rich and ornate painting. His brother, Lochen Dharmashri, who was a great artist, a painter, a poet, as well as one of the, it seems to me, a kind of real magnet for lay people, aristocratic lay people who came to Mindreling to study not just meditation, not just philosophy, but really the kinds of skills that they would need to rise to high positions of authority in diplomatic and sort of bureaucratic roles, as well as lay people. On this side of the bottom register, you can see Tardak Lingpa's eldest son, Pema Gyatso, who both of these figures were tragically murdered during the Dzungar invasion, which we'll talk about towards the end of the talk. Here, so Mindreling, yes, it was founded with the direct support of the Fifth Dalai Lama and the Fifth Dalai Lama's regent, Dese Sangye Gyatso, who arguably, I think he was at least as important in the foundation of Mindreling in certain ways, less so symbolically, but behind the scenes, was certainly a key actor in shaping the institution of Mindreling. I think that, I'm very happy to see Professor Jake Dalton is here. His work on Mindreling that came out of his dissertation has been so helpful for me in piecing together these different kinds of threads, the state building projects, the ritual projects. But with that Geluk support from the Ganden Podrang that Stacey mentioned, the identity of the monastery, the identity of Tardak Lingpa and his family, the kind of core members of the monastery in its early period, was very strongly oriented towards the Nyingma or ancient school. And that is, it remains a very, very key aspect of Mindreling's identity today. So I should mention that Mindreling is still a very active community of practice with centers in central Tibet. The center in central Tibet is generally quite quiet at this point because of the political situation there. As with so many Tibetan monastic centers, the sort of potential for practice and ritual activities kind of ebbs and flows depending on other factors. But for the most part, it's fairly quiet these days. But there is a very vibrant and active Mindreling Center in India and Dehradun, and also communities of practice in Europe, Taiwan, and the United States. So all of those strongly affiliated with the Nyingma school. So this is an image. The image quality is not great, but I sort of like how situated it is in the monastery. You can see that it's covered by glass to protect it. And one of the visitors to the monastery looking at the image from above here. So Stacey kindly mentioned the longer history of this family, the Nyo clan. One of my main questions as I approached the history of Mindreling was, quite simply, why Mindreling? Why was this particular family the focus of the Dalai Lama and his regent's support? Why, once the monastery was established, did it become such a sort of haven for aristocratic education, as well as ritual practice, and then the sort of central hub for clarifying, refining, crystallizing Nyingma rituals that other monasteries then sort of took up and adopted as their ritual systems as well. So what was it that made Mindreling, as prestigious as it was? And so one of my answers, or one of the avenues I took to sort of address this question was to look at biographies and to begin to sort of trace the biographies of Tardak Lingpa and his brother Lochen Dharmasri's ancestors through the Nyo clan. This was their father's line. And one of the key aspects that I saw throughout those biographies was that there was this very strong focus in the biographical materials on the integration of those two kinds of sets of expertise, of dharmic and what I call worldly expertise. Really tracing back not just to what we call the early modern period during the late 17th, 18th century, but much further back, that all of these figures, many of whom were lay teachers, tantric masters, were remembered and were known for their expertise in poetry, in mathematics, in astrology or astronomy, and as well as in a tantric practice and meditation, etc. So really this sort of strong family identity with different spheres of expertise was such an overwhelming sort of characteristic of the clan members. So here again, slightly compressed image, but you can see even the sort of sumptuousness with which the figure is depicted gives you a little bit of a sense of the sort of attention to materiality that goes throughout the materials that I looked at. So here we have an image, a three-dimensional image of the Fifth Dalai Lama, one of the other key actors in this early story. Here you see him depicted with a ritual dagger. This appears to be the depiction of a dagger that Tardak Lingpa gave him. So this shows the Dalai Lama in a certain sense in his Nyingma or ancient school presentation of himself, right? Which was, as we know, especially through the work of Samten Karme, such a very, very important part of his identity. Now, that said, the affiliation with Mindreling, I think we shouldn't take for granted, because of course, this was a time of really intense and sometimes violent conflict between different Buddhist groups and schools throughout the Tibetan region. And so the fact that the Fifth Dalai Lama and Stacey Gyatso were so supportive of Tardak Lingpa and his family at Mindreling is really noteworthy as well. So that will be part of the story that I hope we'll investigate together today. So Stacey also mentioned the role of women at Mindreling. This is just as an example, the biography of Tardak Lingpa and Lodchen Dharmasri's mother, one of the key female figures in the founding period. I want to stress that the role of women at Mindreling is really pervasive. I think that Tardak Lingpa's mother was a very close companion of his. She traveled with him during his treasure revealing activities. She traveled with him during his teaching activities. And he and Lodchen Dharmasri both refer to her as a great practitioner, particularly of the dream yoga practices associated with great perfection, or Dzogchen, as well as really a sort of ethical and moral guide for them. So we see from the earliest days a strong presence of the women in the family as players at the monastery. I think it's important to note that my long sort of deliberation over the question of what kind of factors led for women to be relatively well represented and included in the early history of Mindreling. In some sense, I didn't come up with a kind of idyllic view, but I think in certain ways, this really is, in some sense, about social class, and that this was, a matter of the women of the family were also part of this aristocratic social class, and therefore, in certain ways, were better educated than other women might be, and through that process, were better integrated into the institution than we might see in some other contexts. Here we have a close-up image of Lodchen Dharmasri, who again, in many ways was, as I say, Stacey Gyatso was right there with the Fifth Dalai Lama in establishing Mindreling, and I think Lodchen Dharmasri, in many ways, although the traditional Mindreling sources sort of make an effort to put him in the background because Tardak Lingpa occupies this very central charismatic role. But the more time I spent with my sources, the more I saw his very, very vital presence in this early period. Often acting as Tardak Lingpa's, scribe, but I think really co-authoring many works with him, revising and editing materials that Tardak Lingpa wrote, and really envisioning with Tardak Lingpa the identity of the monastery that in many ways would really continue with a fair amount of consistency, a surprising amount of consistency, up until the 1950s, to a surprising extent. So here, I also want to draw your attention to these sort of wonderful offerings. Here you can see bolts of silk and materials. That there's a monk engaged in textual production or copying texts, and here Lodchen Dharmasri perhaps writing a letter or composing. But I think many of the activities that are depicted here will come out in our conversation, or I hope so, as central to Mindreling's institutional identity as well. Another of the key early female figures from Mindreling was Tardak Lingpa's daughter, the great practitioner and teacher Mingyo Peldren, who in many ways became very instrumental in preserving the monastery and helping to, with the help of aristocratic patrons, helping to rebuild it after it was really almost completely destroyed in 1717 by a group of Dzungar Mongols. I'll mention, I think we'll have more time to talk about this really devastating and violent period later in our discussion, but I did want to mention that when I say that the Fifth Dalai Lama and Stacey Gyatso, as of course very prominent members of the Gelug school, that they supported and even sponsored the founding of Mindreling, I this shouldn't give us the impression that there was sort of a widespread agreement amongst their Gelug colleagues in the sort of value of the Nyingma teachings and the value of the Nyingma institutions. It seems to have been very, very contested. And in fact, it appears that the Dzungar Mongols were encouraged and sort of even directed to Mindreling and Dorje Drak, one of the other main Nyingma monasteries in central Tibet, in that violent campaign by members of the Gelug school. So, you know, to recognize again that this was fairly extraordinary affiliation. So one of the, beyond the kind of focus that I take on aesthetics at Mindreling and cultural production, material production, textual production, is this sort of, you know, in many ways, a kind of keystone of Mindreling's identity is great perfection or Dzogchen teaching and practice. And this was always there as one of the key kind of forces that drew students and lamas to Mindreling to study, to engage in ritual practice and teachings. And so again, you know, by focusing on certain kind of worldly aspects of Mindreling's identity, I would never want to give what would be a very false impression that at its sort of core, it's not a monastery that's dedicated to all the other kinds of to the kinds of Buddhist activities that we think of, right, for monasteries as well. So here's an interior. I think this is from 2009. This again, you can see some of the sort of intense aesthetic sort of experience that's shaped by entering any Tibetan monastery. But this will be where I'll pause actually, and then I'll invite Stacey just to ask a few questions. I think actually maybe I'll leave the images up if that's okay, Stacey, for now, and that way I have a few other slides that might become relevant. I think people can see us.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, I'd really like to talk or give you the chance to talk about, the key focus of your book and the term in your title, right? Aesthetics. And, from what I understand, it's clear that you were early on interested in material culture and the material aspects of production. But I think this term also in your usage, bridges writing, literature, textual production also. So I'm curious how you are defining and employing this term of aesthetics, how Tibetans themselves talk about aesthetics. You mentioned in your book that it's more of an implicit discussion than an explicit discussion. And maybe one of the sort of fundamental contradictions that, this might bring up for, widespread, popular imagination of Buddhism. And I think our first question in the Q&A was getting at this too, right? We think of Buddhism as a fundamentally renunciant of the material world. And yet, clearly the founders of Mindreling and teachers at Mindreling were celebrating aesthetic pleasures. So, what role do those contradictions play in the discourse of aesthetics at Mindreling?
Yeah, thank you. So absolutely, I think that, again, if I think about the history of my relationship to this research, that question of, just what is all this stuff doing here? Why are Tibetan monasteries so full of sensory, stimulation? The sense of smell, obviously the sense of sight, sounds. It's so kind of intensely sensory and sensual, the experience of being in Tibetan Buddhist spaces. And so I think one of my first questions early on in this research was really about that sort of basic relationship between renunciation, which again, I don't at all diminish the kind of dedication to the work of renunciation, to the discipline of renunciation amongst these sort of early founders of Mindreling. But my question was really, taking renunciation seriously, what sense can we make of this vibrant sensory world? And, when I first began to sort of theorize about aesthetics as a way to think about this, it was, maybe appropriately, I guess, Mindreling is famous for these instructions on lucid dreaming. And I don't know if it was a lucid dream, but I sort of woke up from a dream thinking, oh, aesthetics is a kind of connection between the kinds of activities that Mindreling became famous for, educating, bureaucrats and diplomats and aristocrats, helping in a sort of, being a part of this sort of state building project in some complicated ways, being associated with certain kinds of martial or violent rituals, and that were part of a bigger sectarian or regional conflicts. How does that relate to the Buddhist values of cultivating enlightenment, of limiting attachment, of deciding, making good decisions about what to abandon and what to embrace. So what is the relationship basically between what I'm calling aesthetics, meaning the stuff of the senses, and renunciation? One answer that I came to in the sources that I think is sort of a valuable starting point, at least, is that the problem with materiality for Buddhist practitioners, for teachers like Tardak Lingpa, is it's in the attachment, right? I mean, the problem is, one can be surrounded by materials, one can engage with materials, one can build an institution which requires, for instance, funding and affiliations with political actors, and still engage in renunciation, right? And that's because, of course, in a certain way, renunciation is also the work of, a sort of cultivation that one does in one's mind. But I think I don't want to go too far with that, because at the same time, part of my question for the book is really, how do dedicated renunciants, visionary figures like Tardak Lingpa, how do they manage the competing demands and the competing requirements and stresses of having authority in the world? And, again, as a kind of landholding aristocrat who has connections to political power, how does one balance that, or how did he balance that with the dedication to renunciation, the dedication to the pursuit of liberation? And again, I in my sort of methodology, I really tried to take those things equally seriously in a certain sense. I think that when I say that their treatment of aesthetics is more implicit than mine, that's because I found, once I started looking for the work of the senses, right, if I'm defining aesthetics, not just as the philosophy of beauty or the philosophy of art, or even a kind of intentional relationship to design, although that's certainly there, those things are all important to me, but really starting with a more foundational definition of aesthetics as pertaining to the senses and the objects of the senses. What I found was that there's concern with this everywhere throughout the Mindreling sources, right? In the descriptions of historical figures, right? I mean, it's so clear that physical beauty is strongly associated with virtue, right? That, we can see the descriptions of Tardak Lingpa that students leave in their biographical materials show us that his physical appearance is really meant to convey to us as readers a sense of his goodness, right, and his merit. And so there's one kind of, again, a clear example of the connection between the senses and ethics. But I think also Tardak Lingpa, one of the ways that he contributed not just to Mindreling, but to other Nyingma monasteries, was through his visionary experiences, then creating very, clear, reproducible liturgies that could be engaged in. And even today, when I've met with, with Mindreling practitioners and asked them about, what makes these Mindröling rituals excellent, right? Because there is this a kind of idea within the Mindröling materials that I looked at that Mindröling is and should be a kind of reliable source for the right way to do Nyingma rituals, right? And that the emphasis in the sources and even in conversations that I've had with living practitioners is that Tardak Lingpa, through his visionary insight, had a kind of access to the sensibilities, to the tastes of the deities who are the focus of the offerings, right? So this problem of, if offerings in ritual activities are meant to, in one way or the other, engage and appeal to the senses of not the human actors, but the deities, how do you know what they like and what they don't like, right? And so Tardak Lingpa, one of the ways that he's so central is that he is understood to have this visionary access to answer those questions. So, I think for me, the senses, obviously in a certain Buddhist sense, the relationship to the skandhas, this sort of sense that our senses can certainly lead us astray from practice and from the values of Buddhism, but in another sense that they can also be utilized, right, to engage, right, to teach, to engage with others, and to create this kind of experiences that also support practice. So those are some of the ways that I see aesthetics working in inherently and implicitly in the historical sources. Once we get into more modern sources, the 20th century sources, then Tibetans are thinking about, Tibetan authors are thinking about aesthetics in ways that, overlap with and support, I think, my reading. But when I look at Tardak Lingpa, Lochen Dharmasri, they're clearly concerned with beauty. They're clearly concerned with the relationship between beauty and virtue and correctness. And they're clearly very concerned with the senses and the objects of the senses. But I didn't find that they were sort of, using the same language that I'm using of aesthetics. I'm sort of applying that theoretical lens.
Maybe this would be a good time to ask you too about, the different ways that aesthetics or the material world is engaged with in the different kinds of sources that you use, right? You look at such a range, letters and biographies and these monastic catalogs. Can you talk a little bit about the sources that you used and how their engagement with the material world maybe varies?
Yes, thanks. So this book came out of my dissertation research and my dissertation that I wrote at Columbia. And when I started the project, I actually really conceived of it as a material history project and intended to work much more closely than I ended up doing with the objects, right? With sculptures, with images, with mandala that I read about, right? Because Mindreling has, as like so many monasteries, has such careful documentation of the objects that are within each part, for instance, of the monastery, the paintings that are there. There's a very, very attentive documentation to those material aspects of the monastery. Because of I had limited access to those actual materials, partly because of the events of 2008, when there was the really widespread protest, maybe we could even say kind of uprising in Tibetan areas. At that point, I had been on my way to conduct further research in Tibet and in central Tibet in particular. And a lot of that sort of became obstructed, for other reasons, for political reasons. And so in some sense, I turned to my texts asking similar kinds of questions, and luckily found that actually there was a really very detailed, intensive documentation again, and attention to the kinds of materials that I was curious about, and the kinds of materials that I hope to hold in my hands and work with. So it became much more of a textual project for practical reasons. But I wasn't disappointed in the sense that I found everywhere I looked this kind of attention again to materiality in the senses. That I don't want to say it's not unique by any means to Mindröling, right? I mean, I hope that the book is also opening up ways of thinking about these topics beyond Mindröling. I just think Mindröling happens to be a very kind of clear and kind of crystallized example for us. But the ways that I saw that working were quite different. Like, say, for instance, in monastic catalogs or karchak, that those in certain ways are kind of almost, well, they're catalogs of objects and of spaces in the monastery, but they always came with stories, right? So the objects would be followed by, list of objects would also be followed by, stories about how they were produced, who engaged with them. And so there was a kind of relationship between objects and history and narrative in those karchak. When I looked at biographies, in some sense, I found almost a kind of inversion of that, or the mirror image of that, where the stories of someone's life, say stories about Tardak Lingpa as a small child, would sort of include as illustrations examples of his engagement with materiality in the senses, ways that he engaged in certain kinds of miraculous activities that were demonstrated through his use of materials and materiality. And so in some sense, the materials came as a secondary aspect. I also see, certainly in letters, which often the letters that I worked with mostly were in the sort of form of songs and poems, often through, we can see the use of metaphor engages the senses, right, really very, very actively in Tibetan literature. And so I saw again and again that the senses were coming to the fore. And then, of course, when you start to see it everywhere, the question is like, how do I filter this and make sense of it to tell a story about the history of the monastery? And so I think that maybe in the other questions, we can think about how the decisions I made to make sense of all that, because it is one of those experiences where once you look for it, of course, you see a lot of it.
Yeah, and a couple of the anecdotes, for those who haven't had the chance to read this, very rich book with such great, anecdotes and stories. And there's the wonderful tales about Tardak Lingpa as a child, right? And how he's seen as a sort of tantrumy baby who throws his teacup, and yet the teacup doesn't break, right? So this is, could you say something about how you interpret that incident in the
Yes, I
book?
love this. So Lothar Dharmashri, in his the outer biography of Tardak Lingpa, written by his brother, he sort of goes on these sort of, they really feel very kind of familial kind of tangents about, there's all these stories about him, Tardak Lingpa, this renowned figure, when he was a little boy. And yes, he was a little bratty and spoiled perhaps, and he behaved, badly in all these different scenarios. Which often, again, as you're noting, often bring out a certain kind of relationship to the material world, like being able to have, to demonstrate, sort of manifest anger, but without having negative material consequences, right? So there were quite a few of those stories where he would sort of have a tantrum and throw something like an aristocratic, friend of the family's earrings, but they wouldn't break, or his teacup he'd throw, but the tea wouldn't spill, no cup wouldn't break. And so this sort of mastery over material was so embedded in the kind of depiction of Tardak Lingpa as a figure. And there again, I think that's a really important way of understanding the relationship between his stature and status as a Buddhist figure, with his work with materiality in the world, right? The sort of sense that he's working with it, but at the same time, he's depicted as being sort of above it in its kind of normal iterations. I love those stories. I think there's a way that you can also really see the almost as if his younger brother is sort of having fun, reporting these like somewhat unflattering anecdotes.
As the biographer.
Yes.
And there's also the really beautiful, arresting story. I think you alluded to it when you showed the image of the ancestor of the Nyo clan too, right? And you mentioned this in relation to Tardak Lingpa, that, both the ancestor and Tardak Lingpa are described as physically beautiful in their appearance, as handsome, and that physical beauty of the person, of the teacher, was not just skin deep, as you write, but a signifier of virtue and skill, mastery. So that sort of positive valence of aesthetics for for the effectiveness of the teacher, and in perhaps recognizing who should be a good teacher. Are there other ways that you saw that are there other ways in which material objects support Buddhist practice in sort of a
Yes,
right, in a
certainly.
positive sense?
Yes.
What is the importance of these objects for Buddhist practice and of the material world?
Yeah, thanks. I think I may have the passage. I'm just going to see if it's next. Let me go see up here. Here, I just thought I'd share this because this was, I think, the passage you're referring to. And then I'll go on to answer the other question about how objects support practice. But, this, of course, this is not, again, not unique to Mindreling and to Mindreling sources. We see, if you think about depictions, Ashwagosha's depiction of the Buddha in the life of Buddha, there's such a strong focus on his physical allure and beauty. And it's not for nothing, right? I mean, I think we have to take it seriously. It's not extra to the significance of the depiction of Buddha or of the teacher. So this is a depiction of the ancestor. In the Tibetan region of Karak, the people had never before seen such an attractive and handsome figure. With strong, healthy limbs, he was a pleasure to look at. The bridge of his nose was high, his forehead was broad, his eyebrows were long, and his features were distinguished. As for his skin, like the jasmine blossom, it was white and smooth, making him nectar for the eyes. So, again, I think I compare this at various points to physical depictions of Tardak Lingpa when students are approaching him. And I think you're exactly right to focus on efficacy. And I think that the relationship between ritual efficacy and aesthetics is really central. And it also is central to the beauty or the aesthetics are central to the efficacy of teachers, that the ability to reach the senses of the student, right? In some cases, they even talk about a sort of scent of the teacher, obviously the visual depiction, the sound of their voice being melodious and mellifluous, that all of these, okay, we can just skip over those passages. Maybe that's not what we're looking for, but in another way, I think it's really important to pause and to note the connections between ethics and aesthetics, right? Between the kind of claims of virtue and claims of sort of beauty and appealing to the senses. I think that the relationship between objects and practice are so widespread and manifest, but I don't want to state the obvious too much, but certainly there's a way in which material objects, images, so whether two-dimensional or three-dimensional images, objects that have been rediscovered through treasure revelation, material objects that have been touched and used and held by previous masters. There's so many examples. It's so widespread that these can be sort of, integrated not just as a kind of vague inspiration, but really as a kind of a conduit to support and support practice and to increase the benefits of practice. And so I think that we've got lots of evidence, again, beyond the Mindreling materials, that the materiality and practice can go hand in hand, especially as with material objects as the support for practice. And I think then that other question of what are the risks of becoming attached to those materiality, to those material objects. Mindreling's authors, Mindreling's founders were concerned with that, but I found interestingly that it was almost as if they were more concerned with students at Mindreling who wanted to jump ahead to radical renunciation, who wanted to engage, for instance, in solitary meditation, when the founders were very often pressing them to remain in the monastery, to remain as part of the daily community of ritual practice, which they were directed to, sort of cultivate very carefully, and very much in exact keeping with the texts. But this sort of sense that the risk wasn't so much that people would become attached to the materiality of the kind of ritual practices, but rather that they would project a kind of misguided view onto radical renunciation, meaning leaving the community to go and meditate in solitary retreat. That was seems to have been sort of marked as more of a risk than engaging with materiality, which I find to be quite interesting. But partly because it's so difficult, right? It's difficult to do solitary retreat well, and so there was a strong emphasis on sort of first cultivating the kind of careful work of being able to do the material actions of ritual, and then with a kind of gradual accomplishment, and also if one had the capacity, was deemed to have the capacity to then engage in real material renunciation. So to me, in a certain sense, maybe could go against some of our expectations about the emphasis for teachers like these.
Well, and it underscores also the idea that the founders of Mindreling were selectively creating, right, their version of ways to practice, of ways to engage, of ways to describe what was the right way to do things, right, is one way you put it a little bit ago. Both an excellent way to do things, and also the right way or the appropriate way to do things. And I guess this segues into something I hoped that you would talk about also, your framework of worldly matters, right, or worldly expertise to. So this, for those who are maybe outside of Tibetan studies. And by the way, I also just want to say that just encourage people to continue placing questions in the Q&A box. We're going to move to audience questions very soon, since we're coming towards the end of our time in 20-25 minutes or so. So yeah, just to encourage you to put questions in the question box, which I'll get to next. But so, for those who are perhaps outside of Tibetan studies, there is this, ongoing engagement with these two systems, right? This desire to understand the two systems, the Lukni, the worldly, and the Buddhist and worldly. But there are many ways in which the idea of that you translate as the worldly has been engaged with or translated. And, by, the early political historians, for instance, this might be translated as the secular sphere or even the political sphere, right? So the Buddhist versus the political, the Buddhist versus the secular, the Buddhist versus the temporal. What led you to, and maybe how did your focus on aesthetics lead you to this particular framework? And how do you feel, what's the work that framework is doing for you? How does it encompass some of these other ways of thinking about Buddhism and the world, or even the political choices, right? That or the selective choices that these leaders are making about the kind of Buddhism that they are teaching.
Thanks. Yes, I chose the word worldly rather than secular, rather than temporal, rather than political, because I felt that all of those, in some sense, worldly is a little bit stranger than any of those. And so maybe that's a downside, but also I hope that it draws readers' attention to the fact that I'm trying to, in some sense, trying to use an English word that encompasses as many of the kind of aspects of life as I see represented in the Tibetan sources, for that kind of category, right? It's really most of what we experience, right, in a certain way with Ch and Si. Like even in the fields of knowledge that were so important at Mindreling, which I have here, I think as well. The 5 major fields of knowledge, so dialectics, grammar, medicine, arts and craft, Buddhism, and then those are followed by the 5 minor fields. So these are altogether the 10: astrology, poetics, composition, synonyms, drama. These were very, very important in the education that was available at Mindreling, and part of what made it so famous up until the 1950s. And that, I didn't want to use a term that was limiting, for instance, to politics, right? Which is, I think everything's political, but in another way, I didn't want to give the impression that this is about a kind of, government, right? It's, and on the other hand, I think, temporal maybe has similar resonances. I thought about society, but I think, again, I like worldly in the sense of the sort of scope of being in the world, but also for me, a kind of focus on experience, an experience that's largely dictated by our senses, right? By our senses and being in the world. So that's a sort of, I played with a lot of other terms. I think at a certain point I used secular. But I think secular is so loaded in the field of religious studies, and is often sort of, pitted in this way of a dichotomy with religion. And I think that the actors I'm looking at Mindreling are not viewing it as another world. They're viewing it as part of life that one has to manage and work with, just as one manages and works with Buddhist practice. So in some sense, I was trying to avoid a certain kind of dichotomy as well.
Thanks. And, again, you have this other article that I would also direct people to on the secular, or the subjects of learning, right? The worldly subjects of learning,
yeah.
Where, it just becomes quite clear the opening up of that this framework is doing, I think, and the rather than the tendency to see that, from our vantage of, the American government, right, very clearly in our early constitutional materials, separating the spheres of religion and governance. Part of what your book is showing is that, both in the social world and also in the quote unquote political world, these are completely enmeshed and encompass much more than just what we think of as, traditionally as the Buddhist, and on the other hand, the political realm also encompasses much more than what we think of as, secular concerns.
I should say too, I think that part of what appealed to the Dalai Lama and Desi Sangye Gyatso about the family at Mindreling was that they were really practiced through the generations at integrating those types of expertise. And actually the Mindreling authors really don't seem to problematize the relationship between the religious and the worldly, or the Buddhist and the worldly. They seem to be quite comfortable with it. And I think, again, that was one of the things that made them that had the Dalai Lama and Desi Sangye Gyatso looking to them as a certain kind of exemplar, because that was exactly what they were trying to figure out how to do in their state building project, was integrate those kinds of authority.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I want to move to some questions from our audience now, and we have about at least 15 minutes, maybe a little bit more, to discuss some of those. And first, I wanted to take a question or a couple questions together that bring up one of the central aspects of Mindreling and its uniqueness in some ways as a monastic institution. Professor Jacob Dalton asks, can you talk more about what kinds of lay people came from Lhasa to study at Mindreling, and what kinds of subjects they studied, presumably with the monks at Mindreling? Do you know how these lay visitors studied, or how the lay visitors studied there, in the same classes with monks or separately?
Yes, thanks so much. Great questions. So This is mainly from biographies of some of the aristocrats who went to Mindröling in its early period to study, that I've gleaned this. For the most part, it seems that the main thing they went to Mindröling for was poetics, was first and foremost. So it was literary arts, but really particularly Yingap. And so that was, Lochin Dharmashri in particular was renowned as a teacher. But when you look at the biographies of aristocrats during that period, many of them, even if they didn't go to Mindröling in person, had tutors. And it was very often noted that their tutor came from Mindröling, that this was a kind of a very, very important marker of social status, is to have had either a tutor in your home from Mindröling. And again, it was primarily poetics that they were teaching the aristocrats. So I think that for me, that led me to really think a lot about the power of writing and the importance of writing in worldly power and governance, but also in sort of establishing a kind of social status or standing. So of course, poetics is very important in all kinds of Tibetan literature. And I think that having the kind of skill that one gained through either going to Mindröling or studying with monks from Mindröling, that one could sort of have access to that sort of authority. And then the second question, the sense I get is that they mostly had private tutorials when they were at the monastery. They certainly participated in some of the ritual activities, learned how to do those basic, foundational rituals of Mindröling's kind of daily or liturgical calendar. But for the most part, the accounts that they give are of having one-on-one kind of tutorials with teachers at the monastery. That's the impression I get. I don't get the impression that they were. I think actually there was a lot of one-on-one tutorial teaching going on. There were small classes as well, but it wasn't only the aristocrats who were doing that or the lay people who were doing that. But that seems to be how they studied. And the main, like I said, much more than anything that I would call Buddhist, they seem to be going there because of their interest in poetics.
And again, in terms of our sort of expectations for monasteries, right, that we expect everyone in these monasteries to be renunciant, and, perhaps we expect monks to stay at a monastery for their entire careers. So, there were also these aspects of different types of renunciation, right? And then different lengths of stay, and the porousness even of the monastery and other forms of learning, the tutors.
Absolutely, the same.
All very significant.
For the schools in Lhasa, there are also some aristocratic schools for aristocrats who were going to go on to government positions in Lhasa around this time. They were also generally staffed by former students at Mindröling, monks from Mindröling. So you're right, it was very porous in that way. And also it's clear from the monastic materials that from the guidelines for monks, for instance, that there was the expectation that people were coming and going. They'd come for a certain period, or maybe to study a certain chapter of the Kavya Darsha, if they're studying poetics, and then they would go. So you're absolutely right to stress the porousness, and also that you may come and you may get permission to go into solitary retreat for some period, but there was also the sense that you could get called back, especially if the perception was that you were lazing about and not adhering to the basic guidelines of behavior as well. So there was, I think you're right, it was quite porous.
Mm-hmm. I have maybe one more follow-up question, but let's see if there's more questions from the audience too, and I would continue to encourage you to post those. Karen Greenspan had a question about the dance traditions of Mindröling. Do you have any information about these dance traditions, possibly from some of Tardak Lingpa's treasure revelations or other noteworthy Cham traditions there?
Yes, so absolutely, the Chan tradition at Mindröling has been very, very important. It has remained quite vibrant. Again, I've been sort of amazed at the consistency of a lot of the commitment at Mindröling institutions to Tardak Lingpa's visionary, output in terms of dictating ritual activities. So I would say that certainly there's a lot of material on Mindröling's dance tradition. It's not something that comes to the forefront in my book so much, but I would say actually if you're interested, you'd be very welcome to email me. I could direct you to some sources on that. But actually it was a very vibrant and important tradition and remains so for members of the Mindröling community, monastic community.
I was just thinking in the reference to the earlier question too, and the coexistence and co-learning between the lay people and the monks. You have this really interesting discussion of Miwang Polane, the Tibetan lay leader Polane, and his time at Mindreling. And one of the anecdotes that sort of stuck out to me in particular were he talks about leaving his lover, right, on the way to join the monastery. And then I believe after he leaves the monastery, he, reignites his relationships with his, various partners. But then also at, his encounter with the teacher, Tardak Lingpa, also has this quality to it of this quality that sort of bridges devotion and love, right? And appreciation on various levels. So yeah, I don't know. I wondered if you wanted to talk any more about what the lay people renounce and what they don't renounce when they come to Mindreling.
Yeah, thank you. Such a good question. So absolutely, the biography of Polane obviously has multiple rhetorical projects that are happening simultaneously. And one of them is certainly to portray him as a virile man, right? He becomes the king of Tibet, right? He has this very, very significant political power. And it's manifestly evident that the author, his friend and actually fellow Mindreling alum, Dokharwa, really was, integrating the stories about his lovers and his relationships with women as a, part of his persona as a figure of authority and power. And so there's no sense, and in that, it's in fact in one of the chapter, the section of the biography on Mindreling, that we get this very erotic telling of his last, his parting with one of his lovers. And as you say, it goes right into his meeting with Tardak Lingpa, which is actually quite similarly, infused with, again, the sort of sensory responses to his physical presence that have markings of the erotic, right? And I think again, this is not at all limited or particular to Mindreling sources. So many devotional texts engage with the kind of affective language, of the body there's a lot of slippage between, or maybe it's not slippage, maybe there's resonance between the ways that people describe responding to a teacher for whom they have devotion and the ways that they respond to engaging with a lover. And so I think that that's a really, really rich area for further kind of analysis and interpretation, but certainly something that we see in the Mindreling materials again and again. And I would say, for me, once again, that is a kind of evidence to the importance of, paying attention to aesthetics, right? To the experiences of being in the world and the ways that those may not be very clear cut always between the worldly activities of being with a lover and Buddhist activity of meeting a teacher. But I think that in terms of when they were at Mindreling, there was certainly the expectation that they were, during the time that they were staying at Mindreling, that they were celibate, that they were, following the basic guidelines for the monastic community. So there's no sense at all that, somebody like Polynea, a lay aristocrat, would have continued his activities, with his amorous activities while he was at the monastery. So during that period, he would have been expected to follow those rules.
Temporarily. That's interesting. Hannah Hart has a question. Did you find that different senses, sight or smell or sound versus sight, played distinctively different roles in individual spirituality? Did you get the impression that there was a hierarchy of senses where specific senses were deemed more or less spiritually potent? Hannah says, I found the nectar for the eyes phrase especially interesting because it mixes sight and taste and suggests that sight is made more profound when it is described as something that is physically consumable.
Yeah, I really like that question. Thank you. I would say there's a very strong focus on the visual. If I haven't thought about this way or theorized this before, so I really appreciate the question to give me an opportunity to do that. But I would say that in just in terms of, if I do a kind of quick cataloging of the kinds of texts that we've been talking about, there's a very strong focus on the visual. I would say next would be the audio or hearing, and not as much on scent or taste, but they're there, and they're significant. But I think that they're not as prominent as those others of sight and hearing. If that's a spiritual hierarchy, I don't know, or if it's just a reflection of practical experience, sort of what comes to mind first when we start to focus on the work of our senses. It may be something more practical. I've certainly never seen a Tibetan kind of theorization of the senses as being in a hierarchy, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I will take that question further, away with me and see what I can find. But I like the way you're thinking. Thank you.
Maybe to sort of wrap up, I can ask you one last question along these lines, which is, I was just wondering if you thought about or could articulate any ways in which the Tibetan case, the Tibetan engagement with aesthetics and thinking through, questions of materiality and the importance of the senses in this case, how it might contribute to, wider discussions in other fields, if there's something that we can take away from the Tibetan case that might shed light on aesthetics more generally and those scholarly discussions.
Thanks. Yes, I hope so. I really hope so. I mean, I really I benefit a lot from connecting with other scholars of religion and historians who and anthropologists who are interested in affect and the senses, and there are lots of us. I mean, in the most simple, the first step, I think, is actually just, I think, moving away, if we have maybe a presumed, how do I say this? I think sometimes we use aesthetics to mean superficial, and that there may be a tendency to think of aesthetics as having to be only to do with a superficial beauty or appearance. And I think that would be the first, my first hope would be that we'd move away from that as scholars and sort of dig in when we find evidence of the senses and aesthetics in our materials. And after that, I think then the next steps that I hope we'll do, in sort of interdisciplinary work of thinking about these topics is, in some sense, like moving beyond the descriptive, right? Moving beyond sort of explaining where we see evidence of the senses and beginning to theorize together, right, about what it can tell us. Like, for instance, the question that came up about the kind of spiritual weight or value of different senses. It's such a rich question. So that's where I'm sort of excited to go. And certainly that resonates far beyond the field of Tibetan studies or Buddhist studies.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, Dominique. And thanks once again to the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion and to everyone who joined us in the audience today. And we look forward to not only your future projects, Dominique, but to bringing you in person to campus in the future to discuss them.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so
Amazing.
much. And thanks again to the Center for the Study of Religion and to everyone who came and all of you who stayed till the very end. So great. And I really appreciated your questions. Thank you so much, Stacey. Great to see you.
Great to see you. Great to see you.
Thank you all.